Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
First today, in the last half hour, Vote Leave have been outlining some of their key economic arguments for leaving the EU. Speaking at an event in Stratford-upon-Avon, Boris Johnson says Britain will be forced to hand over even more money if voters opt to stay in the EU, and that the economy was Leave's only argument.
What they want to say is that we, on our side of the argument, are selling democracy, because that's what we believe in, and they say that they, on their side of the argument, are selling economics, and because they think they have the stronger hand there. And that's basically because on their side of the argument, on the Remain side of the argument, they totally get that we are winning all the democratic points. And the fact is that if you look at what is going on in our country and around the EU, the European Commission is unelected, and there's a lot of concern about the way that operates. The European Parliament does anybody know the name of their Euro MP? OK.
Well, that question left hanging. The Prime Minister has also been out and about in London today as he joined leading figures from the left of British politics. Labour's Harriet Harman, Lib Dem leader Tim Farron and Natalie Bennett of the Green Party. And the Prime Minister took aim at the Leave campaign, who were being, quote, undemocratic and reckless.
They're performing an economic con trick on the British people, and we are calling time on it. Today we publish the full extent of this con. The dossier we publish outlines all the various and often contradictory positions that they've held on the economy. Those who want us to leave want to leave the single market. We don't know what terms of access they'd get instead. As this dossier shows, they've lurched from one idea to another. First they said we should be like Norway, then Canada, then Albania, then America, and along the way they've taken us from Iceland to the Isle of Man and Morocco and Moldova.
The Prime Minister, well, this morning's crossfire comes after an extraordinarily personal attack on leading figures in the Leave campaign by the former Prime Minister, Sir John Major. Here he is on the Andrew Marr Show yesterday.
I do find it very difficult to understand how Boris can justify the 350 million that he has on his battle bus, that he and Michael Gove in particular have defended time and again. You know, I know, the IFS knows, everyone knows, Boris knows, that the real net amount that we send to Europe is about 1/3 of that. The concept that the people running the Brexit campaign would care for the National Health Service is a rather odd one. I seem to remember, well, Michael Gove wanted to privatise it, Boris wanted to charge people for using it, and Ian Duncan Smith wanted a social insurance system. The NHS is about as safe with them as a pet hamster would be with an hungry python.
Ooh. Last night on the Westminster Hour on Radio 4, the Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is voting to leave the EU, hit back at John Major.
What we've had today are the bitter ramblings of a vengeful man. That he is the man who took us into the exchange rate mechanism, destroyed hundreds of thousands of jobs, had people evicted from their homes and led to the destruction of businesses for the sake of his failed European policy. And now he says things that are both hypocritical and untrue in his attack on Boris. And how magnanimous Boris was in saying we should rise above it. Well, I'm going to sling the mud straight back at Sir John Major, a Knight of the Garter who ought to know how to behave better.
Well, amidst all that mudslinging, I mean, John Major unleashed a torrent of vitriol yesterday at Leave campaigners. I mean, particularly with his description that leaving the NHS in the care of Ian Duncan Smith, Boris Johnson and Michael Gove would be as safe with them as a pet hamster would be with a hungry python. What's going on?
Well, there are a lot of lurid descriptions that have been going on throughout this campaign, and I fear we'll see more of it in the next 17 days. I must confess, I've long been a believer in what Ronald Reagan once said, the former US president. He said that he would speak ill of no other fellow Conservative, and I think that actually applies to Douglas as far as I'm concerned.
But you're in a diminishing group, aren't you, Mark?
I think it's very important to play the ball and not play the man. I mean, listen, there are some very important issues here. I think everyone would agree this is more important than any single general election. It's probably the most important vote that Douglas and I would have had in our lifetime to date. And Listen, let's be honest. I mean, John Major, probably of all people, had the most provocation, given the difficulties he faced as Prime Minister, and a lot of that frustration, I think, boiled over yesterday.
So was he justified in saying what he did?
Listen, I wouldn't have made it personal. I mean, I think there are some very strong emotional arguments where I would disagree with what Boris Johnson said earlier. It isn't just about the economics. I think that this is a very important decision, but the interests of the United Kingdom are not the only consideration here. You know, we have had friends and allies in Europe for the past 70 years. We played an important part in rebuilding Europe, which seemed as broken as the Middle East is today. Our part we played in that means that we have friends and allies and their interests matter too. And the message coming loud and clear from politicians across the party political divide throughout Europe is they desperately want the UK to stay in the European Union and play its part in reforming it.
How worried are you that the Tory party is tearing itself apart?
Well, listen, I would prefer that we were able to, as I say, to look at the issues rather than making it personal. So, yes, I'll be honest, like a lot of MPs, I am worried about this, partly because actually amongst us as backbenchers, we've got a very cordial relationship. I've been very good-humoured. There's a lot of joshing going on amongst us at backbenchers, but what we see at the very prominent figures is something that is not upsetting many of us. And I look at our activists across the country. You know, I feel for Dan Watkins, our candidate in the Tooting by-election next week, and how he must be feeling, trying day in and day out to make the case for the Conservative Party when these arguments take place.
But Douglas Carswell, Jacob Rees-Mogg is a backbencher, and he has, in his own words, been mudslinging as well.
Well, can we look at this other than through the prism of the internal dynamics of the Tory party and its leadership issues? We're seeing some incredibly strident, hectoring and negative language coming out of Downing Street. The Prime Minister today used a very unfortunate
From both sides.
He talked about a bomb under the British economy. That's a very unfortunate terminology. The Leave campaign has outlined an optimistic alternative. And it's precisely because we are outlining an optimistic, upbeat alternative with 5 pledges about how we can make things better if we vote Leave, that I think we're beginning to win the argument.
Do you think warning about 76 million Turks being able to come to Britain is a positive, optimistic campaign?
It's the truth. If you have pressure on public services at the moment...
How many Turks have passports?
At the moment, you have about 80 million people in those 5 countries that are, including Albania, Montenegro, Macedonia, and
Turkey. I'm
Serbia.
Just throwing that out because that was
80 million people who will soon have a right to settle here if they join the EU, and I think it's only right and proper. The risks of Remain are many. One of those risks is that we will have unrestricted migration. We already have 450 million people with a legal right to settle here. If you add on an extra 80 million people with a legal right to settle here,
but at the moment,
that is a risk in remaining.
But they don't have a right to settle here,
But that is a risk in remaining, and the onus is on the Remain campaign to explain these risks and what they would do if people vote to remain.
Douglas, there are risks that we see on our shores only in the last few days. What is the answer to having dozens, maybe hundreds of Albanians coming onto our shores? The reality is we are signed up to a lot of international conventions that have nothing to do with the EU. The notion that we're going to be able to get rid of people, that we can secure our borders and make them safe, really is a fallacy as well. And as far as the Turkish thing is concerned, listen, we all know, and I'll be honest, I've always had my doubts about whether Turkey should join the EU, and I think actually many Turkish politicians today are less keen on it than they were 5 or 10 years ago. But the truth is, it would be vetoed first by the Greeks, by the Cypriots, by the French, by the Germans.
So why are we spending £2 billion preparing for Turkish membership of the EU? One of the risks of remaining is not only that Turkey joins, but we have to pay more, not just to bail out the Eurozone, but the migration crisis becomes unmanageable. That is a risk of remaining that I don't think we can afford to take.
Let's talk about the NHS, the claim that was made by John Major. He pointed out that Michael Gove wanted to privatise the NHS, that Boris wants to charge people for using it, and Ian Duncan-Smith wanted a social insurance system. How would you manage the NHS,
Joe,
Douglas?
I've fought and won 4 elections defending the local NHS. I think I've earned the right to be heard about the NHS. The NHS is absolutely vital. If we vote to leave, every week we will be able to spend an extra 100 million on the NHS.
If the government decides that they want to do it. Let Mark Field answer.
You and I both know that actually, in the scheme of things, whether it's 7, 8 or 10 billion a year that we will save by not being in the EU, that is a minuscule amount in the terms of a budget of £900 billion a year. We are already overspending. We're living beyond our means and continue to do so. We're going to be borrowing 75, 80 billion pounds this year. The notion that somehow this money in toto will just go straight into the health service really is a myth.
Right, but hang on a second. Let's just come back, because that's the claim, the 350 million pounds that you talk about, and it's a gross figure. Let's just be clear, it's a gross figure. Half of that, around half of that, comes back in terms of rebate, and there are pots of money and payments that go to things like agriculture. So let's talk about the net figure, because if I lent you £50 and you give me £25 back, I've given you £25, not £50.
Have a chance.
Yes.
We give a gross contribution of about 20 billion, a net contribution of about
18 billion.
If you look at that net 10 billion contribution, we're suggesting that about 5.2 billion, that's about 100 million per week, should go on the NHS. About another 2 billion should be spent on taking VAT off fuel bills. That is money that currently we're giving to Brussels,
so
that we think
we
should spend on improving the
manifesto.
NHS and taking VAT off fuel for older people. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
Now, Mark may be against 100 billion for the NHS, but we're in favour of 100 billion for the NHS rather than for Brussels.
Well, my view is this. We've heard a lot of this stuff about VAT on fuel before. I think it was Ed Miliband, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. These are the sorts of populist, quick-fire so-called solutions being put forward.
There's an EU directive in 2006 that means that we can't do anything about it. We say that if we vote to leave, we can do something about it. We can remove VAT from fuel by voting to leave the EU. At the moment, that EU directive of 2006 prevents us from doing that. I think that's wrong.
The much bigger concern I have is
I'm concerned about fuel bills and the NHS.
Well, the idea that we're going to remove ourselves from the single market, and I speak to businesses large and small, not just in my constituency but in other parts of the country. They're very worried about that, and I know why.
I know why struggle to pay their fuel bills.
Let Mark finish that point.
I know why Vote Leave went down that path to say, here we are, let's get out of the single market, because it's the only way in which they can square the circle as far as immigration is concerned. But actually, it is a very serious prospect. The idea that we remove ourselves from the trade deals, the single market, one of the greatest successes that the European Union has, to have a single market of 500 million people.
It's stagnating.
No, and I accept more work will have to be done. I think is one of the things.
That's one way of putting it.
Part of the reform that goes forward is to make sure that is rolled out into services as well.
We'll have to finish it there, because guess what? We're going to discuss this further during this programme, and for the next few weeks, in fact. But it's time for our daily quiz, and the question for today is, who of the following is not related to the Prime Minister? Is it A, Boris Johnson, B, Harriet Harman, C, Nigel Farage, or D, the Queen? That's who's not related to the Prime Minister. And at the end of the show, Mark or Douglas will give us the correct answer.
Neither of us are related, incidentally.
Thank you. Well, thank you for clearing that up.
Anyway.
Yes. Have you checked? Right.
I've been